Nothing but superhero movies. I swear I didn't mean for this to happen. The X-Men film franchise and I have a rocky history. I have net positive feelings toward most of them, but something I can say with more certainty is that I find First Class and Days of Future Past to be far and away the best of them. Both of those feel unique and well executed in a way I don't feel much with the rest of the series outside of particular moments, and the Wolverine released between those two films was also a decent character piece for the titular Hugh Jackman. Needless to say, I'd been enjoying the franchise more than I ever had after Days of Future Past's release, which is why it saddens me so much that I feel so about its direct follow-up. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. X-Men Apocalypse picks up with Charles Xavier running his fledgling school for mutants, while his best frenemies, Mystique and Magneto, are off doing who knows what. Mystique has been being hailed as a hero to mutant kind after the events of Days of Future Past, while Magneto has actually settled down with a wife and daughter. Things get thrown for a loop real quick, though, when the world's very first mutant, Apocalypse, rises from his ancient slumber and decides almost immediately that the 80s suck, and he's going to make himself the world's only superpower. I find it kinda weird, honestly, that the X-Men movies have been around for nearly 2 decades now, and despite having the prejudice against minorities as its central motif that entire time, X-Men Apocalypse marks the first film to bring the subject of religion into the argument, something made obvious through its title sequence alone, on top of the fact that we're barely 8 minutes into the film before we're getting a literal fight between an angel and a demon. Unfortunately, the religious implications of the story never go much farther than Apocalypse considering himself a god and the admittedly interesting question raised indirectly at the very end of whether or not God is working through the X-Men themselves and mutant kind as a whole. Though like I said, this is indirect and it might even just be me reaching way too deep into the subtext. Either way, it's a question that's raised but never discussed, so it ultimately feels like kind of a waste to have a basic doomsday plot so laden with religious imagery and references that go nowhere. There is the question through Magneto of whether or not he was destined to be the monster that he is, but that's not an explicitly or even necessarily implicitly religious sentiment, and again the movie doesn't go even half as far exploring it as it could have. It's a shame because we have an overtly religious character in the form of Kurt aka Nightcrawler, and Apocalypse's very existence calls into question the validity of nearly every religion but most of all Christianity. To have a Christian character in the piece and never do anything with that is a massive waste, and I know it might have just been to avoid making any religious audience members uncomfortable, but that was an inevitability when broaching this material. And if there's any superhero franchise that's primed to tackle this subject except maybe Thor, it's the X-Men. Hand in hand with this problem, I feel, is that the movie is set in the 80s, but unlike First Class, which was set in the 60s, and Future Past, which was set in the 70s, it doesn't really do anything interesting with the decade. Those two movies really couldn't have been set in any other time. Apocalypse's time period is really just there for stylistic reasons and consistency, I guess. The previous two movies used the Cuban Missile Crisis and the drug problems and overall cynicism of the 70s to draw interesting parallels between the period and the story of the characters. Unfortunately, all we get from Apocalypse is a little wink wink nudge nudge, look how clever it is that the villain of our superhero movie wants to get rid of nuclear superpowers. There are a lot of baked-in problems that keep this movie from realizing its potential, the first of which is a lack of focus the other two didn't suffer from. Really, the movie's whole flow is just kind of off, especially in the first half, which is especially unfortunate because that's easily the better half. The pacing and the keeping track of where exactly we are in time is all sorts of wonky. For example, what should be a continuous sequence of Mystique escorting Nightcrawler over the course of a single night is spaced over about 40 minutes of other scenes that take place over at least 2 days. But pacing issues are something that can be overlooked if they're a means to a compelling end. The first truly big problem is the movie's namesake villain. Apocalypse himself is a weak villain. The religious aspect is interesting in concept, but in execution he's just boring. Now wait a minute, you know who he is? He's Ronan. He's Ronan from Guardians of the Galaxy, except even less interesting because the context surrounding him doesn't make his sternness goofy. It really is a waste of Oscar Isaac and a waste of valuable screen time whenever we focus on him. The same unfortunately applies for most of the characters here. The three main characters of Professor Xavier, Magneto, and Mystique are all still decently characterized and well acted, and while I'm not the biggest Jennifer Lawrence fan, I'm not going to jump on the bandwagon of people saying she's phoning in her performance. Honestly, I think the problem is just that Simon Kinberg's script isn't giving anyone anything nearly as meaty as the last films to work with. That seriously caught me by surprise, since the thing that impressed me most about Days of Future Past was that for the first time in this series, we had an ensemble cast where every member of said cast seemed to be firing on all cylinders. Even First Class had a large supporting cast that barely felt present. Everyone in Future Past was relevant, interesting, and compelling. Unfortunately, that's not a trick Apocalypse was able to repeat, since I was largely uninvested in most of the cast this time around. Jean Grey could have been taken out of the movie and not much, if anything, would have been lost, which is a shame since I'd gone in hoping to finally care about this character after not feeling anything toward Famke Janssen in the role. Cyclops and Nightcrawler fare a bit better, with the former having something close to a character arc, though that gets lost in the shuffle about halfway through the movie, and the latter providing 2 or 3 decent laughs. Jubilee is a glorified cameo, and Storm, likewise, is a character with an arc that makes sense, but doesn't amount to enough to make her anything more than a halfway interesting throwaway. Psylocke and Archangel are just there to be henchmen for action sequences and get next to no dialogue, etc., etc. Quicksilver is the one character who I was really invested in the whole time on account of how fun he is to watch, but his whole arc about knowing Magneto was his father and confronting him about it amounts to nothing. And when I say it amounts to nothing, I don't mean that it's inherently bad that he doesn't confront Magneto. His choice not to do that could have been used to say a lot about him, but the fact is he goes from wanting to tell him to not wanting to, and there's really no reason for that shift. When he changes his mind and decides to keep the secret, it doesn't feel like a natural choice, but instead something the writers decided to do because they don't want to tackle that yet. The unfortunate result of having so many characters who all come off so thin is that once we reach the action climax, it really does feel like just a bunch of noise in the end. The action, as I've found this franchise to be regularly guilty of, is more about showcasing the myriad of powers than anything else. Yeah, much as I still don't hate this franchise, this movie made me realize a lot of its recurring flaws, one of which being how the action scenes in particular really are just for the awesome spectacle, without being rooted in character all that much, which is fine. Not every action scene in every comic book movie needs a bigger excuse for just looking cool than getting the plot from point A to point B, I got it. But it just serves to show how weak the writing is compared to First Class and Future Past, neither of which felt the need to indulge in action beats that didn't in some way enhance the drama or enforce aspects of a character. The only scene that really does that in Apocalypse is the Quicksilver scene, which is, to be fair, at least as good as the running sequence from the previous film, and doesn't feel like too much of a rehash thanks to different circumstances, and an overall different feel that's reflected in the more up-tempo music choice. I just wish it weren't the case that what was ultimately the least necessary scene in the previous film is being redone as the only standout moment in this one. What makes the lack of strong characterization so much worse is that it could have been avoided by just eliminating the 30-minute plot cul-de-sac that is the inclusion of Weapon X. The sudden reappearance of recurring franchise baddie Colonel Stryker does nothing for this movie but give us an admittedly brutal and visceral but pointless Wolverine action sequence. Seriously though, the decision to grind the Apocalypse story to a screeching halt just so we can get in a mandatory Jackman appearance baffles me. The conflict was just ramping up. One of our recurring characters had just died, and rather than use the next several minutes to develop the characters and ideas through that conflict, we just kinda stopped the movie only to pick it back up just in time for the big finale. It's a detour that breaks the entire second half of the film and by extension weakens everything that came before it. I know I keep comparing this movie to its predecessors, and that's kinda unfair, but I don't think it can be overstated just how much First Class, and especially Days of Future Past, was really a validation of this franchise to me. Watching Future Past in the theater brought out emotions that I'd never known I could have toward this franchise, and when I wrote my stupid written review of it the week it came out, I posited that it would have been the perfect ending to the entire film series. Not that I didn't necessarily want to see the story of these characters be continued, but knowing that it was all leading to Future Past had at least partially redeemed every film that came before. Leaving that movie, I'd felt privileged to have experienced the ups and downs of this decade-plus long cinematic journey because the light at the end of the tunnel had made it all worth it. It just really sours that feeling to now be past that light only to see more thoroughly lackluster tunnel waiting behind it. There's just this signification with this movie that the peak of this franchise is now firmly behind it, and ultimately I left this one feeling really disappointed for that reason. Unfortunately, I am going to be in the camp that compares Apocalypse unfavorably to the likes of Last Stand. I know, right? As someone who freely admits that I don't think that movie holds up on a story level, I still had a more fulfilling experience watching it than I did this movie. And while the two share a lot of the same problems, Apocalypse feels much more like a trip for biscuits. So, thanks for sitting through my dumb review again. Do you have any particular agreements, disagreements? If so, sound off in the comments. And also, if you enjoyed listening to me ramble, how about clicking that subscribe button or pressing any one of these annotations to see some other review I've done? I swear I don't just do superhero movies, I'm trying.